On January 11th, 1755 or 57, Alexander Hamilton was born out of wedlock in Charlestown, British West Indies, which is Nevis Island. Orphaned as a child, sponsored and groomed by the wealthiest British West Indies men after being recognized for his intelligence and skills. The super wealthy sent him to New York City to finish his education, which is where he stayed. He played many significant roles as a founding father of the United States. Hamilton practiced law and founded the Bank of New York with support from the Rothschilds. As a Federalist Party member, he advocated big government. In 1979, Hamilton was Secretary of Treasury and basically as an agent for the Rothschilds in George Washington's cabinet. Through Hamilton, they set up Rothschild's Bank in the United States, called Bank of the United States. The bank was established 1791 with a 20-year charter, which ran out by 1811, and Congress voted against its renewal. The United States government had quickly begun to rack up a debt to Rothschild. Hamilton was denounced by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as too friendly toward Britain and monarchy in general. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson in the debate over the recharter of the bank bill. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States and author of the Declaration of Independence. This was a large part of the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. The movie, The Devil's Advocate, theatricizes a lot of true history as well as current reality. It describes the relationships between legal, banking, and political systems, why they burnt down the White House and the Library of Congress in 1814, why the War of 1812 was even started. In 1810, Congress passed the original 13th Amendment for ratification by the states, which would have prevented the legal system in England, as well as the manipulation of international bankers, which are integrated with each other, from infiltrating and entrenching themselves in the United States. Congress decided not to renew the Rothschilds' bank charter in 1811, and every state who had voted for the original 13th Amendment up to 1812 had voted to ratify it. The original 13th Amendment threatened to disallow the English legal and banking systems, which were entangled together, from infiltrating the United States at this same time. More on the original 13th Amendment later. The Battle of Waterloo was 1815. The British had just burnt down the White House in 1814. The peace treaty between the United States and Britain, called the Treaty of Ghent, was just signed December 24th, 1814, and ratified by the U.S. Senate February 17th, 1815. So basically, right after that, here's what happened with the Battle of Waterloo, fought between England and France, June 18th, 1815. Rothschilds were funding both sides of the wars. When a government is dependent upon bankers for money, they, and not the leaders of government, control the situation, since the hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France. Rothschilds knew that Napoleon was only going to get as far as they wanted him to, which is when they cut his funding. They had developed a special communication system using carrier pigeons, so they knew 24 hours before anyone else they'd won the war, and sent one of the sons, Nathan Rothschild, into the London Stock Exchange. They had placed 8 dummy corporations around the stock exchange floor. All his son had to say was one word: sell. As they watched the known Rothschild companies begin to sell off everything they had, everybody else thought the Rothschilds knew something they didn't and started selling out of fear. By the time the news became public that they'd really won the war, that stock went through the roof. Some aspects of this story are debatable today. However, this is another time in history where maybe we'd have all been better off if they'd have just killed us all. Because after all, money is life force energy in exchange. Let's take a few steps back. Back in the year 1095 AD, or Common Era, the first Crusades of the Catholic Church began with a war against Muslim forces in the Holy Land, and Muslims vowed to wage holy war, jihad, to recover. The main Crusades lasted about 2 centuries until the end of the 13th century, ravaging hundreds of thousands of Muslims. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church's support efforts and papal authority dissipated, and the Muslim Reformation arose. As the dust settled from the Crusades, the VOC, Dutch East India Company, and then British East India Company, and others began to come on the scene. Just Google their names for a more detailed history of abuse of the super elites, and you'll see how they sailed around the globe with intentions of forcing submission on peoples from across the globe before ever stepping foot onto their shores. And the Native Americans were not their first conquest. Not the first and not the last. Each conquest was premeditated. The movie, The Last Samurai, shows us some of the actual history of abuse of Native peoples in Japan for political power and money. Although they can be based on real-life events, we know the nature of movies still tends to fictionalize events, but there are some powerful messages, like the last words of The Last Samurai. Perfect. They are all perfect. A beautiful perspective. With enough perspective, everything is perfect. Sometimes this kind of perspective makes it easier to move forward. Beginning with the Spanish, various versions of the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," have been used to describe empires of global size. After the Battle of Waterloo, it was said, "the sun never sets on English soil." And British soil, same thing. How many have heard that popular phrase before? M. Rothschild and Sons was the first international bank. The M stands for mayor, and the Pope of the Catholic Church became their most famous customer. Some say it was the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church that went out on a mission to find the biggest fractional banker operation they could for business alliance purposes. And they chose the Bauer Rothschild family for the Catholic Church to do all their banking through. So they decided to hook up, trust, and became very wealthy together. However this happened, after the Battle of Waterloo, the Rothschilds had crashed the French government bond market and stripped the wealth of French investors by 1818.